The Dining Room Fireplace by R. H. Malden. Anyone who knows the neighbourhood of Dublin will remember the good-sized country houses in which it abounds. Most of them date from the 18th century, when Irish landowners were prosperous and labour was cheap. Some of them incorporate bits of older buildings which may have begun life as castles of the Pale. Most of them are now in a state of dilapidation which is not unpicturesque, though it would be out of place in England. Perhaps I ought to have used the past tense. I do not know how many of them have survived the establishment of Éire, or whatever that part of Ireland chooses to call itself nowadays, and I do not feel tempted to go and see. I am writing of things as they were during the closing years of the reign of Queen Victoria. It was during a visit to one of them in the autumn of the year 1899 that the experience, I can hardly dignify it by the name of adventure, which I am about to relate, befell me. It belonged to a family named Moore, who had inhabited it for several generations. The present owner was a young man, unmarried and in the army. Naturally, he could not spend much of his time there, and was glad to let it when he could. It had been taken for one summer by some cousins of mine who lived in Dublin, and it was on their invitation that I was there. I need not try your patience by attempting to describe it in detail. There was nothing very noteworthy about it, except an almost ruinous tower at the northwest angle. This was obviously much older than the rest of the house, and we young people thought it ought to contain a ghost. We could not, however, hear of any story to that effect. We explored it pretty thoroughly, but found nothing more exciting than a very large quantity of dust and a few bats. We went there once, late, on a moonlit evening, but even then we could not pretend that we saw or heard anything unusual. The south side of the house consisted of 3 large rooms, a drawing-room at the western end, then a dining-room opening out of it, and lastly a billiard-room, which was also used as a gun-room. Probably, in fact, it had been built as a gun-room, and the billiard-table had been added afterwards. It had a door leading into the garden, but there was no access to it from the house, except from the dining-room. The dining-room was hung with portraits of bygone Moors, who had, no doubt, played their several parts adequately in their generation. But none of them had reached fame, and the pictures were of no outstanding artistic merit. The collection as a whole looked well enough, but was not likely to be of much interest, except to members of the family. One picture there was, however, which did arouse our curiosity. It represented a man of about 30. There was no name or date upon the frame, but the dress was that of the closing years of the 18th century. The most remarkable thing about it was the attitude which the sitter had chosen to adopt. He was astride of a chair, with his arms folded and resting on the top rail. His back was towards the spectators, so that his features would have been invisible if he had not been looking over his left shoulder. His face, so far as could be seen, did not resemble a Moor. The upper part suggested considerable intellectual power. The lower part was not pleasant. The whole effect was formidable, and bespoke a man who would be a very dangerous enemy. The execution was not particularly good. In fact, the technique suggested an amateur. But it was impossible not to feel that the artist had caught the likeness of his original well, and difficult not to regret that he'd done so. We wondered why such a curious picture, which did not look like a family portrait, should be displayed so conspicuously. It looked as if there must be a story of some sort about it. A few days later Captain Moore called. He was stationed at the Curragh, and having some business to transact in Dublin, very civilly looked in to ask after his tenant's comfort. We ventured to put a question about the curious portrait. "Yes," he said, "it's a fantastic thing, isn't it? Clever in a way, though, and I should think a good likeness, but I don't know who it is, any more than you do. It isn't one of the family. You'd guess that, I hope, by looking at it. All I know about it is that my great-grandfather, the old boy over there," here he pointed to a portrait of the same period, which hung exactly opposite on the other side of the room, "stuck it up about the same time of the Union. I think he painted it himself. Anyhow, he was so keen about it that he left directions in his will that it was never to be moved. So it's been there ever since. I expect there's a story, if I knew what it was. I believe my great-grandfather had been pretty wild in his young days. A lot of his generation were dazzled by the French Revolution, you know. I dare say it looked better at a distance than at close quarters. But while he was still pretty young, about the turn of the century, I think, he turned over a new leaf. Model country gentleman, magistrate, church warden, all that sort of thing, you know. And I believe a really good man into the bargain. Very charitable and so on. Not very hospitable, though, by all accounts. In fact, during the last years of his life, when he was a widower, he would hardly see anybody, and I believe he was nicknamed the Hermit. I remember once, when I was a little chap, about 6, I think, I was playing in the dining room on a winter afternoon. I think the nursery chimney was being swept. Anyhow, I'd been sent downstairs for some reason. It was getting dark, and something gave me a terrible fright. Funny thing, I couldn't say what it was. I don't know now, but I think it was something to do with that picture. I ran screaming into the drawing room, and my mother was, and though I couldn't tell her what was the matter, I'm sure that she thought it was that. When I'd been comforted, my father came in. He'd been out shooting, I think, and she began to talk to him very earnestly. I wasn't meant to hear. Don't suppose I should have understood much if I had. I do recollect that she said something to the effect that it couldn't go on, and this wasn't as if it was the first time. And he said that he couldn't do whatever it was she wanted him to do. I suppose now she was asking him to have the picture moved, or to get rid of it outright, and he was reminding her of the clause in his grandfather's will. Of course, 99 women out of 100 would see no reason why the wishes of someone who'd been dead for more than 50 years should be allowed to interfere with their own. Anyhow, that was the nearest approach to a quarrel which my father and mother ever had that I can recall, and the picture stopped in its place, as you can see. I once asked him about it. He looked very grave and was silent for a minute or two, as if he was making up his mind about something. Then he said, "I'll tell you what I know about it some day. But not just now. You must wait until you're older." I had to be content with that. Both he and my mother died soon afterwards, and I went to live with an uncle on her side. My father had been an only son, and the house was shut up for several years, so I never heard the story, whatever it might be. I expect old Barton at the lodge knows something about it. He's been at the place all his life, and his father and grandfather before him. But I'm pretty sure he wouldn't tell anybody, if he did know. After Captain Moore had gone, I went and examined the picture more closely than I'd ever done before. I came to the conclusion that it was a cleverer thing and a more repulsive subject than I'd thought at first. One thing perplexed me very much. I tried to put myself into the position of the sitter, and found that I could not twist my head round as far as his. His chin was almost on his left shoulder. Why had he chosen to be painted in such an unnatural, and indeed, as it seemed, impossible attitude? And how had he contrived to sit for it? I don't think the expression rubberneck, which I believe to be American for sightseer, had been coined then, or if it had, it hadn't crossed the Atlantic. But I can think of no one to whom it would be more appropriate. A day or two afterwards I happened to see Barton in his garden, and I thought I'd try whether there was anything to be got out of him. Like all his kind, his conversational powers were remarkable, and he was never unwilling to exercise them. Eventually I got him onto the pictures in the house, and thought that he seemed to feel that he was being drawn towards thin ice. How would the like of him know anything about them, or photographs either? Sure, I must ask the young master about them, and wasn't he in the house only last week? I recognized that Captain Moore's estimate of him as a source of information on this point had been accurate. A few nights afterwards, when we were all in the drawing-room after dinner, I had occasion to go to the billiard-room to fetch a book which I'd left there. Dinner had been cleared away, so I took a candle to light me through the deserted dining-room. Just as I was passing the fireplace, I was conscious of so strong a draught that my candle guttered and was nearly blown out. I supposed it was a downdraft due to the large size of the chimney and to the fact that there was no fire in the grate, and rather wondered why we'd never noticed it before. It wasn't a windy night, so that if there were a strong draught now, one would suppose that it was a permanent feature of the room, and that whoever sat on that side of the table would want a screen behind his chair, but hitherto no one had made any complaint. On my way back, I was surprised to find the draught equally strong in the opposite direction. It was now sucking inwards towards the fireplace. I held my candle high, shielding it with the other hand, and looked round to see if there were an open window. But the windows were all securely shuttered, and the doors at each end of the room were shut. I couldn't account for any draught, much less for one which had apparently changed its direction, almost as if it were due to the slow breathing of some gigantic creature crouching in the fireplace. While I stood there, the inward draught suddenly ceased. After a moment's stillness, there came an outward puff, really strong enough to be called a gust, which blew my candle out. That was too much. I groped my way to the end of the room as quickly as I could, without stopping to light a match. Once out of the room, I felt rather ashamed of myself for having been so easily scared. I suppose that was why I didn't feel inclined to say anything about what had happened. Probably, I said to myself, there was really more wind outside than I'd imagined, and of course a rambling old house was likely to be full of unaccountable draughts. Most likely this one depended upon the wind being exactly in one quarter, which is why we'd not noticed it before, and more to the same effect. But I did not find this cogent reasoning convincing. When I went to bed, I looked out and everything seemed to be perfectly still. This, I was bound to admit, was as I'd expected. 3 nights later, I had a curious dream. I dreamt that I was in the dining room, and that the figure over the mantelpiece had come down from his frame. He was seated astride of a chair, as he was painted, almost in the fireplace. His back was turned to the room, but instead of having his head upon his shoulder, it was turned away, so that nothing could be seen of his features. He appeared to be speaking with great earnestness to an invisible personage who must have been stationed a few feet up the chimney. I couldn't catch what he was saying, for he spoke very rapidly, but his tones were those of a person in deep distress. When he'd finished speaking, there came a rumbling, moaning noise in the chimney, such as is made by the wind on stormy nights. This presently began to shape itself into words. At first they were not at all distinct, but gradually they became clearer, though they seemed to be in a language unknown to me. I wondered whether it could be Irish. The voice spoke very deliberately, with a cold malignity of tone which made me feel very thankful that I couldn't follow what it was saying. There was something indescribably evil about it. It was the most unpleasant sound to which I've ever listened, asleep or awake. If fear can make the hair stand on end, I must have resembled a clothes-brush. At this point I woke, and it was more in obedience to some automatic instinct than to any reasoned courage that I decided to visit the dining room. I do not know what, if anything, I expected to see. As I opened the door, there was a grating sound, as if a chair were being hastily dragged across the uncarpeted part of the floor. But I told myself that that was caused by rats. The house abounded in them, and everyone knows they can make extraordinary noises. I suspect they're at the bottom of a great many ghost stories. I advanced to the fireplace, but beyond the fact that the hearthrug was curiously bundled up into a heap, a circumstance which did not for some reason strike me at the moment, though I wondered about it afterwards, there was nothing in the least unusual to be seen. My candle burned quite steadily as I held it high and looked round the silent empty room. I stared up at the odd, forbidding picture about the mantelpiece, but there did not seem to be anything to be got out of him. Upon the whole, I was glad of that, for he did not look like the sort of person I should have chosen for a midnight tete-a-tete. "Well," I said aloud, addressing the portrait, "I wish I knew rather more about you, but as you aren't in a position to explain yourself, I shall go back to bed." I did so, and slept soundly for the rest of the night. Next morning I didn't mention my dream to anyone else. Perhaps I was a little ashamed of it. Also, the walls of Irish houses have even acuter ears than those elsewhere, and I didn't wish to be responsible for an outbreak of hysteria among the servants. It so happened that I had no occasion to be in the dining-room alone, after dark, during the next day or two. Perhaps I was at pains not to be. No one commented upon the curious draught which I'd noticed. Indeed, I do not think it was perceptible in the daytime. My dreams, when I had any, were, as usual, entirely commonplace. One evening, when my visit was almost at an end, one of my cousins and I were sitting talking in the billiard-room after the rest of the family had gone to bed. Our conversation turned on ghosts and apparitions of various kinds, a subject in which we both took a keen, if sceptical, interest. Dreams and their value, this was before the days of psychoanalysis, and the possibility of their coming true were also discussed, and when it was past midnight, when we got up to go to bed. We then found that there were no bedroom candles for us. Presumably they'd been left in the dining-room or in the hall beyond it. The oil lamp by which we were sitting was too big and heavy to take with us. As it was past the middle of September, and the day had been wet, we'd had fires in the sitting rooms. The dining room fire had been burning brightly when we finished dinner, so it was probable that there'd still be enough of it left to prevent our passage through the room from offering any insurmountable obstacles. So we put the lamp out and prepared to go. As soon as we opened the door, we saw that our surmise had been correct. There was a sufficient glow in the fireplace to light us down the room. But we'd hardly taken a step before we were startled by a rapid thudding sound, such as might be produced by a big dog beating his tail upon the floor. There was a dog about the place, but at night he had his own quarters in the stable yard. Even if he'd not been put to bed then properly, he had certainly not been in the dining room during dinner, and could hardly have got there since. The thudding ceased as suddenly as it had begun, but next moment we were even more startled by seeing the fire beginning to disappear. I remembered a story which I'd once read, by H.G. Wells, I think. In it the lights in a haunted room go out one by one, and as the occupant rushes to the fire to rekindle them, that too dies away into absolute blackness. But we soon saw that our fire was not going out like that. It was being obscured by some large dark object which was rising from the ground between ourselves and it. It was as if the hearthrug were slowly humping itself into the form of an animal of some kind. It rose and rose without a sound. Soon it was larger than any dog, and its movement had somehow an uncanny suggestion of deliberate and malign purpose. Its bulk and outline, so far as we could make them out, suggested a bear more than anything else. But the head was not shaped like that of a bear. There was something more than half human about the outline which made it peculiarly terrible. There seemed to be a nose, not in the least like the snout of any animal. Presently no vestige of the fire was to be seen. Then it suddenly reappeared. The creature, whatever it was, had gone up the chimney. We felt that the longer we waited there, the less we should like it, so as soon as the coast was clear, we ran down the room as hard as we could go, keeping as close as possible to the side away from the fireplace. There was plenty of firelight in the drawing-room, and we soon laid hands on our candles and made our way upstairs. Our bedrooms opened into each other, and we left the door standing wide. I don't think either of us slept well, but there was nothing to disturb us except the owls, who, we both thought, were noisier than usual. Next day we told our story to the rest of the family, and I added what I had to say about the mysterious draught and my dream. Of course, there was only one thing to be done. The whole thing must be laid before Captain Moore as soon as possible. Meanwhile, the doors of the dining room must be kept locked and meals served in another room, which a house agent would probably have called the breakfast parlour. I was obliged to return to England on the following day, so it was some weeks before I heard the sequel. In response to an urgent, if guarded letter, Captain Moore came over from the Curragh as soon as he could get a few days' leave. He soon knew all there was to tell. His first step was to pay a visit to the lodge, but unfortunately the day before his arrival, Barton had had a stroke from which he never recovered. He seemed to recognize his master and be glad to see him, but he was in no state to be questioned. He died that night. Next day, his daughter, who lived with him, told us that after Captain Moore's visit, her father seemed to have something on his mind. Just after midnight, he sat up and made an effort to say something. The only word she could make out sounded like trouble and back of the picture. Immediately afterwards he fell back on his pillow and expired. This was something to go upon. The queer portrait must be meant. A step-ladder was procured, and Captain Moore and my cousins set to work. It took them longer than they'd expected, as the picture was not hung in the usual way. A number of long screws had been driven through the frame, which was very solid, into the panelling of the wall behind. At last they were all got out, not without difficulty, though they did not seem to be particularly rusty. The immediate result was disappointing. There was nothing to be seen either on the back of the picture or the surface of the wall. Then somebody noticed what looked like a fine crack running across the top of one panel just below the raised frame containing it. Closer examination showed that the wood had been cut through on all four sides with a very sharp knife. A little picking at the top, and out it came, disclosing a cavity, obviously the work of an amateur mason, in the thickness of the wall. In it reposed a small book, about 9 inches long by 5 broad. At the top of the title page were the 2 words, "The Club," and underneath was a list of 12 names, presumably those of the members. Several of them belonged to families still represented in the neighbourhood. The last was Robert Moore, Captain Moore's great-grandfather. By this time lunch was ready, so further research was postponed. When the party returned reinvigorated to their task, they discovered, as was not unexpected, that what they'd found was an informal minute-book. It was apparently the custom of the club to dine once each month with one of the members and discuss topics of general interest. The first dinner was held on the 14th of July, 1778. There were notes as to the amount of wine consumed, which need not be recorded here. One would imagine that the members of the club must have acted on the principle which was adopted subsequently by Mr. Jorrocks. Where I dines I sleeps, and where I sleeps I breakfasts. There were also notes of the discussions. These were more interesting. At first they were principally political. The recent revolt of the American colonies appeared more than once, and though no formal vote was ever taken, it was obvious that opinion was divided as to the character of George Washington. Some members regarded him as a high-minded patriot, others as a sordid tobacco planter who didn't want to make any contribution to the cost of the campaigns to which he and his like owed their security and prosperity. The revolution in France also aroused much interest. General opinion seemed to have been more favourable to it than most people, at any rate in England, would have approved. But the members of the club were probably all young enough to feel it their duty, as well as their pleasure, to ventilate opinions which would have shocked their elders, could they have heard them. As time went on, the tone of the meetings became less innocent. A certain amount of profanity began to appear, and once or twice some vague entries suggesting some dabbling in black magic. At one dinner, held in the year 1797, there was a note, "The President's health was drunk in bumpers with," probably acclamation, but the fact that the writer had changed his mind more than once as to the spelling of the word, added to 2 considerable blots, had made it indecipherable. On the next page was a plan of the table with the name of each member against his place. There were 6 on each side, no one at top or bottom. The top, however, was marked with an X. From this time onwards there were frequent references to the President, but curiously his name was never given. The minutes were usually initialed JB. James Butler was the first name on the original list, so was presumably the senior member. It was not, however, clear whether he was to be identified with the President. Near the end of the book was an entry in a different hand. It ran, "The club is dissolved. Lord have mercy upon us." It was signed Robert Moore and dated 23rd of September, 1799. My odd experiences had culminated on the 23rd of September, 1899. There was nothing else in the cavity in the wall except 2 small scraps of paper. They had obviously been part of a large sheet which had been torn up. What had become of the rest it was impossible to say. On one appeared the words, "like a bear," on the other, "clean broke." That was all. Despite his ancestors' wishes, Captain Moore felt justified in destroying the portrait. It was soon hacked to pieces, and the bonfire which it made in the garden consumed the minute-book of the club as well. The panel was replaced and another picture hung over it. As far as I know, there were no further disturbances. Perhaps a century is a kind of statute of limitations in such matters. We do not understand them sufficiently to be able to speak positively about them. It seems pretty clear that at its last meeting the club somehow got more than it had bargained for. But it's impossible to reconstruct exactly what had happened. Who was the President, and was the last meeting the first at which he was actually present? Was the queer portrait, which was presumably Robert Moore's work, intended to operate as a warning, like the public executions which were then in vogue? Some years afterwards I happened to find myself sitting next to an Irish clergyman at a public dinner. He was incumbent of a parish near Dublin, he told me. As the evening wore on, and the tide of speech-making flowed strongly, Our talk, in the intervals, turned on superstitions. "It's queer," he said, "the way they can lay hold of people for no reason that anyone can see. Now, there is one grave in my churchyard that the people won't go near, and when we turn in sheep to keep the grass down, the farmer always sends a boy to see they don't graze by it. It's a nuisance, because we always have to scythe that bit, and the sexton doesn't like doing it either. It's an ugly, pompous thing, to a member of a family that used to be well known there, I believe, though there's not been any of them about these 50 years. But why there should be anything unlucky or wrong about it, I don't know. I'm not sure that the people do. Anyhow, if they do, you won't get it out of them." "I wonder," I said, "whether the occupant is named James Butler, and whether he died on the 23rd of September, 1799? "Why, yes," he said. "And how in the world do you know anything about it?" "Oh, I used to have relations with whom I sometimes stayed in that neighbourhood." I thought that was as much as I need tell him.